And the first paper is going to be presented by Tyler Beauregard, and he's going to present his paper on stakeholder perceptions of complex rehabilitation technology service delivery process. So I will just turn it over to you, Tyler, and Tyler will present about 15 minutes, and we'll try to leave about 5 minutes for discussion.
Great. Yeah, so that's exactly it. My name is Tyler Beauregard, here to talk about the negative perception that stakeholders have of the CRT service delivery process. This project is funded by a much larger NIDLR grant and couldn't have been completed without the assistance of our larger project team. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but I wanted to make sure that everybody's on the same page that 5.5 million adults in the United States depend on a wheelchair to be able to interact with the world, to do their activities of daily living, to engage in their community, and to live, really. Their quality of life is really highly correlated to having the wheelchair that meets their needs. And if they don't have a wheelchair that meets their needs, it's pretty catastrophic for them. So the process that, so I also clarify that they need a very customized wheelchair, again, a wheelchair that meets their unique needs. And those customized wheelchairs are what we refer to as complex rehabilitation technology. And the process that we use to match the wheelchair to the patient and to deliver it to them and getting them using it and being able to use it long term is what we call the complex rehabilitation technology service delivery process. It's a mouthful sometimes. But that process is a big and complex system. It involves various groups of stakeholders with wildly different backgrounds whose goals and incentives often conflict with each other. And those groups have to work together over the course of years to try again to match the patient to the correct wheelchair, to deliver it to them, to getting them using it and being able to use it long term. It's a big thing to try and manage. It's very difficult to try and manage that whole process. And our larger project team is filled with people who are part of that process, who are stakeholders in that process themselves. And for a long time, there's been this general feeling of maybe there's room for improvement. Maybe there are some patients who aren't being served well by the process as it stands today. Maybe there's a potential to make things better. The problem that they've run into is that there's a lack of empirical evidence to establish this, like in science. Like there's a paper that shows that this is necessary. And so when they try and go to talk to lawmakers or policymakers, then they run into that. Where's the evidence? We're supposed to be evidence-based. So that is the purpose of this project, is to empirically establish the need for CRT service delivery reform. And then again, because it's such a big system that's hard to manage, we're also hoping to determine priorities for those reform efforts. We do not have the resources to tackle the entire system by itself or as a whole. So we need to find out where we can make the biggest change for our patients and everybody involved with the resources we have. So we're trying to find out, again, what are those priorities for our reform efforts. So we decided to do an online questionnaire to get feedback from all those stakeholder groups to find out if they're having problems with the process. See what their perception is of the CRT service delivery process. And so we started by developing that questionnaire, starting with a scoping review of the literature that our team did previously. And the themes that arose from that scoping review became our initial draft of questions for the questionnaire that we were developing. And those questions were then further refined with 3 rounds of review with subject matter experts. That first round was very informal. It was just our project team. We emailed the questions out, asked, hey, do these look okay? Do we need to change these? And we took that feedback, made some changes. The next 2 rounds were a lot more formal. We added more and more participants who were further and further removed from our research team. And we had those subject matter experts grade the questions on clarity and relevance, and to determine which questions do they think, which stakeholder groups do they think that question is relevant to. And then we had certain benchmarks where if they scored this poorly, then that was our cue that we need to go back and revise them and make changes. And all the details of that are in a paper that we've already published. So if you're really interested in all the benchmarks and the flags and everything, you can go and read that paper. Our questionnaire ended up being 19 questions long, and each of those questions took the form of a statement that are a positive statement about some part of the CRT service delivery process. And then respondents to our questionnaire were asked to rate their agreement with that statement on a standard 6-point Likert scale. Completely disagree, mostly disagree, somewhat agree, mostly agree, completely agree. In distributing our questionnaire, we used a snowball sampling method. Most of those snowballs were seeded by emailing leaders of various stakeholder groups, professional organizations, advocacy groups, things like that. And those emails asked the leader of that group to send the email to the members of that group and inviting everybody to, again, fill out our questionnaire and participate. We also made announcements at various conferences and the social media, the normal snowball sampling things. And then our questionnaire was open for about 3 months for where we were collecting data. We ended up with 1,059 valid responses, mostly from clinicians, also a good number of suppliers and consumers or care partners. We also had an adequate number of manufacturers and payers. We feel that we have their perception adequately addressed. But when we're talking about the big averages, they're probably underrepresented in those calculations. We also had pretty good geographic distribution of our responses. We had responses from every state in the country except for Alaska. And then for our analysis, we ended up mapping our 19 statements to the Resident Wheelchair Service Provision Guide and then the steps outlined in that process. So that would help us, again, group our questions and see which parts of the process was outlined in the Resident Service Provision Guide, how those are going. We had questions that covered every part of the Resident Service Provision Guide except for product preparation and referral. And then we also had some questions that were about the devices themselves and a few more questions that covered, the process overall and not any individual stage of the process. As for our analysis, we also dichotomized the responses. So anybody who gave a completely agree or a mostly agree response, that was considered having just a generally positive perception of that part of the process. And all other responses were considered having a generally negative perception of that part of the process. And then we conducted a descriptive and visual analysis. And here's all the results I can get on one slide so you can still see them in the back. A few things I want to point out. First of all, the most important thing is the overall average. Across all of our questions, only less than 18% of those questions had a positive response, and that's abysmal. That is less than 1 in 5 positive responses across all questions, across all respondents. That's pretty bad. That's not what we would like to see, just to say the least. And it doesn't get better. There's no way that you can slice this data to get a good response. There is no happy ending. There's no, yeah, that's bad, but at the very high end, we had a question about training, fitting, and delivery, and that still only got less than 42% of those questions or those responses were positive. So not even 50% at the high end. And then that's still almost twice as many positive responses on average compared to the next group, the device group. So it's just bad. There's just no happy ending. There's no way that we can get a win out of the data that we collected. On the far end, the other far end, we have our questions about funding and procurement, and those were 5% positive on average. So that's 1 in 20 responses thought that was going okay. So not great. And that was a pretty good outlier because again, the next group up, the follow-up maintenance and repair group of questions had again about twice as many positive responses. So funding and procurement is far and away the worst performing stage of the CRT service delivery process. And that's not even to go into say how much that influences the other parts of the CRT service delivery process. We had a question in that follow-up maintenance repair group that was the process of repairing my wheelchair is easy. And part of what makes it not easy, part of what makes people not agree with that statement is how hard it is to get funding to procure your repair services. So we really feel like that, again, that funding and procurement is ripe for some reform and making some changes there. When we look at the data by stakeholder group, this is what we see, the distribution of the number of positive responses per each stakeholder group. So to orient you to this graph, you can see here that the median supplier had 3 positive responses across all 19 questions. So on the y-axis, we have the number of positive responses across all of our questions, and then we have the stakeholder groups. So the question we always get is, is there a difference between the stakeholder groups? Is there one that's worse or better than the other? Well, I mean, if you're looking broadly, I guess you can say that suppliers have a more positive perception than the rest of the groups, followed by manufacturers, clinicians, consumers, and then payers. But really, I don't think there's a true meaningful difference here. That there's so much overlap between our boxes. I really just don't think that there's really. Again, there's no way that you slice it that looks good, right? It's just everybody's bad. Nobody thinks this is going well, just overall. A couple more interesting things to point out on this slide. The fact that there is no whisker on the bottom of the consumer and payer group means that more than 25% of the respondents in those groups gave 0 positive responses across all 19 questions. 0 parts of the process that we asked about did they think was going okay. So that was an interesting thought. The other thing that was really interesting to me is the sheer number of outliers. Every one of those dots is at least 1 outlier. There's 20 outliers just in the consumers, and that's a ton. You expect to see like maybe 1 or 2, maybe up to like 6. We had dozens. And so I started to wonder what was going on there. I thought maybe we had like bimodal data where we have like a big cluster at the bottom who gave very few positive responses. And then maybe we had another cluster at the top that gave a bunch of positive responses, and that would explain it. So I took a look at the data in a histogram, and no, it is not bimodal data. It is extremely right skewed data. Nearly 1/4 of our respondents gave 0 positive responses across all 19 questions. So again, that's the number of respondents who gave a certain number of positive responses across our 19 questions. Almost 1/4 of them gave 0. And it is just exponential decay as you increase the number of positive responses to our questionnaire. So yeah, again, there's no happy ending. It is just bad. And that's our conclusion, that the CRT service delivery process does need reform. It is not going well. We need to fix it. And that we think that funding and procurement is a ripe area to focus those reform efforts to.